Hello and welcome to the Wolf Den Podcast, your home for competitive Digimon TCG discussion and news. I'm your host Nako, joined by my co-host Zenitsu. This week, we will be discussing the varying deck archetypes of the Digimon TCG, which archetypes each deck falls under, how they play, and the different approaches to deck construction. We are now
And
available on all podcasting networks, including but not limited to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music. Find us at Wolf Den Digimon TCG.
on top of that, we are also on YouTube and Twitch, streamed through twitch.tv/Zenitsu and on the Zenitsu YouTube channel.
We definitely should have rehearsed that. Oh well. Um, so
There was a pause, I'm sorry.
I know. So this week's episode, as I just said, will be about the different deck archetypes. So the common archetypes as it is known to the general card game universe, which deck archetypes fall under which within the Digimon space, and there'll be some room for argument a little bit. I know I have some kind of hot takes in this regard, but just so for those that aren't 100% aware of what it means to be, say, a control deck or an aggro deck or a combo deck, getting a little weird with it. It's not as clearly defined of an archetype, but um, what really kind of just how those decks win the game, how they are built differently, and just the examples that we have in the Digimon TCG.
Yeah, Digimon is definitely a more interesting one because certain decks could fall under multiple if you really like want to get down to the super nitty-gritty. It's just like OTK decks are basically combo decks. But are they actual combo decks or are they actually aggro decks? Like it's weird.
Well, I think the line there, because it's the most gray area, I guess, especially in Digimon, would be that I define, or at least from my experience, combo deck is something that a combo deck cannot be aggro and it cannot be control. I guess one of the ones I didn't mention is mid-range is I guess the true standard third party that isn't combo necessarily because combo can technically be multiple. Um, so while each deck has combos, if they are not as reliant on said combo, they are not in essence a combo deck. I know I watched a video on Pro Magic basically that kind of laid out in a more structured environment what it means to be each deck archetype as a preparation for this, and their definition of combo, which I guess is the most arguable in this entire list, is that if all of your games aren't ending in the same fashion, like agnostic of what your opponent wants to do, you're not a combo deck. So something more like Melga X is kind of a combo deck because for the most part, you are ending your games in a very similar fashion every time, but at the same time, you aren't as defined by that combo. So I would still like you're really close to the line of combo deck. I would not say combo though because
I would agree with that.
you
After playing it and winning with it, it like there's some moments where you have to be flexible in your plays and aka break the combo um that you want to be doing to be able to play efficiently and yeah, I'm not ending the game all the time the exact same way. Like we thought D Reapers was kind of a combo deck and half the time you're not even playing Reaper to actually end the game. It's just an alternate win condition. It's the deck's designed win
it's an
condition, but that's not how
inevitability
you're.
clock.
Yeah,
It's not
it's an
the
inevitability. It's
only
not.
way that I win.
Yes. So initially, we first thought that it was a combo deck, and then we were like, "Oh, it doesn't really kill that way all the time." So I guess it's not a combo deck.
Well, so Melga was my first thing because it does have just a clear line of play that results in a win commonly. If you see all of the things that you need to see in the order in which you need to see them, or at least in the matter in which to see them, that you see all your pieces by the time you need them, you have a combo there. But because the deck has a combo doesn't mean you win via the combo. So just looking at this list from the August Core TCG Regional first place list, you don't have to win the game on, well, first of all, like, there's a indefined amount of chip. That is not part of your combo. That there is not a hard requirement to chip or with what to begin with. It's just any amount of chip, and then you go up your stages, you swing multiple times, you restand, and then you end with something, you know? It doesn't, but it's not always Blitz Omni for game. If it was always, swing, 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 Blitz Omni for game, that is more in combo territory.
And I think red falls into that trap more than um Guru, to
Mm.
be 100% honest, because like this is more Wargrey because it just needs very precise pieces in order to do its thing. I would also say that red ancient OTK, that is more of a combo deck. You just build your stack basically the same way every single time. Swing with your ancient and then blitz for game, or a hybrid if you have enough memory for game, and that's what you do 100% of the time. It's not the most consistent of decks, but that's what it's trying to do every single time. So that is more true to a combo deck.
And I was going to disagree with you, but just through thinking through the full line of play and the process, I already backed myself down off that. Um, Red Ancient OTK is, again, I think one of the better examples of combo, because it is the specific tagline that I took away from the video, the Magic video, was without worrying, like, I don't care if you're up against D Reaper, I don't care if you're up against security control. Does the fact that your opponent's security could be different change your game plan? If it does, you're not a combo deck. Then that's so. But Ancient never cares what their opponent's security is. So they
Nope,
they do
because
whatever they want regardless of who their opponent is.
yep, because usually they'll try to always have Piercing and Alda in their stack and be able to swing for five, if not more, depending on how far they want to go into creating an evolution chain or line that's big enough to break whatever amount of security they feel comfortable with.
And obviously Digimon plays a little differently, so it every deck has pieces it needs to see, or it's not like Magic where, okay, I have a 3 drop and a 4 drop and a 5 drop and they're separate pieces, because in Digimon you're making one better piece as opposed to many small pieces that progressively cost more mana. So um that it's less of a win condition, and it makes you think that more things are combo decks that aren't. But if you take something like Melga X or Alphamon or even D Reaper, and you think, okay, how are they swinging into security versus like Melga X or D Brigade versus how are they swinging into security versus security control? And the answer is they're different. They approach the game differently in that regard. Therefore, like, they kind of get eliminated from the are definitely a combo deck territory.
Yeah, there's not like a whole lot of true combo decks in Digimon based on that, which I think is fine. Like, Digimon is a very combo centric stuff where you're trying to line up these like very intricate lines of play, and those will get repetitive because those themselves are combos, but the actual definition of a combo deck, we don't really have a whole lot of those. But we do have a lot of decent like aggro and mid range and I guess arguably control decks, even if they do look a little bit different than your traditional style compared to other games.
Yeah, you like, it is a lot. It is hard for me sometimes because in some capacities, as I love to say, I guess there are no control decks in Digimon because there's no inter-turn interaction, which is pretty much a staple of a control deck. Is I am physically controlling you in some regard. And up until BT11, basically our biggest form of inter-turn interaction is like BT5
Uh,
Sakuyamon or Blocker, and that's about it.
or security, just
Or
the
yeah, just
actual
the
security.
existence of security. But that's still by your opponent's choice, not by your choice, right? Like that's the difference is
Yes, because
you
they have to
play,
attack in order for you to
yeah.
trip.
Like the difference I think is in the mentality as you approach the card game. You're never afraid of the security controls stopping you from doing something that you don't in some ways at least agree to take part in. There is still that handshake of I'm going to swing security. I hope it doesn't die, but there's at least a strong expectation that it does die based on the likelihood of your security having something that kills me. But against a true control deck, against anyone that's played any amount of Magic, would know the difference is okay. I play, you know, I digivolve into Melga X response, and my opponent says, okay, it dies. Like I've not swung security. I have not. It just dies. Or black like counter spells, removal spells on your opponent's turn as they do something. Anyone that's played Yu-Gi-Oh, those are inner turn interactions. That's where actual control elements, seep into the card game.
Yeah, like Yu-Gi-Oh's hand traps are another good example of like control tools, but like Yu-Gi-Oh is a completely different beast. Just because that game is kind of like, as far as I remember, really fast pace, high damage. You do your big thing. You basically ask your opponent to break it, and if they can't, then they just die.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's still kind of true. It kind of seems that way, but again, I haven't really touched Yu-Gi-Oh in a very long time.
The only I guess the best example still ancient OTK would still be a great definition of a combo deck in Digimon. Our probably highest visibility level on an actual combo basis is the various loop decks that have existed, mostly Lilith Loop. We're about to approach Minerva Loop. Um,
Yeah, because we had Lilith Loop, then there was Creepy Loop, and now Minerva Loop, and they're
and
just doing all the same thing on trying to recycle and reuse the level 5s to go into a new level 6 or do something else with those level 5s.
but the thing is I guess the part that breaks the definition to me is well technically like if anything those decks are doing at a broad definition the same thing every game. The actual
Yeah.
decision making is still very different depending on what you have, what you don't have, how much security your opponent has. There's a lot of things that change based upon the various game states you're in, but the fact that the whole deck is kind of just pushing you towards I have the core TCG fourth place loop deck that randomly popped up in BT9.
I
Um,
don't understand the Ofani Loop. Like, I looked at that deck and I was just like, I do not get what this
this
loop
this is
is.
Lilith loop. It's not Ofani loop. I don't know what that
Oh,
is.
that's Lilith Loop?
Yep, yeah,
Oh,
it's Lilith loop.
there was some Ofani Loop that, like, it's popped up towards the very end of our BT9, and I don't get it. I don't get it at all.
Well, so really, what
It
defines
just looked
this
like
as
Mastemon without DNA.
what defines this as a combo deck to me is how all of these deck's pieces are kind of tapered around the combo, and it isn't just a combo. Like Grandis or Alpha aren't combo decks in the way of get to level 6, do level 6 thing. That's not a combo. That's just having a boss monster. This is all of the level 3s are utilities. Like Gabumon is filtering or looting. Looting is the
Looting.
looting is the literal name for it in Magic. It's draw a card, trash a card. Um, then Gazimon is a floodgate. Lucamon recovers. Psychomon's a floodgate. Those are all of your rookies. None of them are important to your combo as individual pieces. It's just a rookie. Then you've got your Gankus, your or Ginkaku promote with your Kinkaku and your Ginkaku to add sources and do things when it's played. Um, Usually as a means
It's
of actually
yeah,
rushing.
that's usually their actual win condition is like, oh, I'm gonna do all of this stuff, and then here's just a cheap card with rush that I can use.
4 copies of scatter mode. Again, just getting pieces in your trash, getting the pieces you need in your hand. Just and I mean it's we're not going to go over every card, but that's kind of the whole point of this. And then you have your actual
Yeah, you
combo
have a lot of
pieces, and then a bunch of options that are either combo pieces themselves or recursion, allowing you to repeat your combo.
Yeah, like that's kind of just what a lot of purple decks try to do because a lot of purple decks just need specific levels of setup depending on what the purple deck is. And I think like the loop decks incorporate the best of what purple actually is as a whole because it's like you look at all of the purple decks and I don't want to say they're all similar, but they're all like get cards in trash, use cards in trash differently depending on what it is and depending on how you're trying to fill up the trash because you have like self-milling which you just want to run a whole bunch of self mill to get a specific number of cards in your trash to turn your effects online. Like that's just purple at its core, and I think like these purple loop decks are purple at its finest. Like it is the most refined that purple can be because it is dedicating itself to the strengths of purple.
I think it's also the best example of purple in the fact that it's the purpliest purple decks because while Beelzemon exists and has combo elements competitively, it is not on the map. So for
It's
our pur-
barely on the map. It's on there, just not really a huge part of
uh,
it. Like
uh,
a small,
I
tiny little island.
you're gonna make me open it now. Okay, BT9 meta analysis. Beelzemon one, one top 16 once.
Hey,
No,
that's better than some other decks. Some other
actually,
decks can't even
I'm
get
sorry.
one.
I'm looking at BT8. It doesn't exist in BT9.
No, that's not true. I sent you that image. It has Beelzemon. It has two top 16s out of all of BT9 in
Okay.
English.
Well, I didn't have that tournament recorded. But so still
There were two of them.
for our purposes doesn't matter.
I know.
The other one being Mastamon is trash E and like Mastamon kind of cares about its trash, but it's yellow purple. It's its own thing. It's not This is like pure purple with a couple of cards that aren't purple just for the sake of helping purple, but pure purple, loot
Yeah.
Cerberus combo shenanigans.
Yep. It's just because like you try to line up the Cerberus to gain you lots of memory, and then get that body on to then go up into another level 6 to then do various other things or rinse and repeat just to gain more memory. Like it is like that is all it's trying to do. Um, and that's okay. Like that's okay, and that's kind of what makes it more of a combo deck than some of the other decks. Like you can't really say, "Oh, Minerva loop or Lilith loop or creepy loop, purple loop, just purple loop." You can't say that purple loop isn't really a combo deck because everything in that deck is tailored to the combo or to getting to the combo. Whereas if I'm playing Metal Guru X or even Alphamon, like I'm just trying to find my boss monster. Like
Hmm.
that's it. I'm just trying to set up my two cards that let me do very powerful explosive things, and then the rest of it just doesn't matter.
So, yeah, and while obviously I didn't approach the beginning of this discussion with ancient OTK in mind, it also kind of does that. All of its pieces either search for combo pieces or are combo pieces, and everything else doesn't like matter in the deck.
Yeah, like Digimon being a different game than most of the others, I think like the definition of what we would define as a combo in Digimon, like a more combo deck in Digimon, is more of is the deck tailoring to the specific setup of cards, and is like that kind of is what the combo is. Because I don't care what my level 4 is for Metal Guru. Like it could be the promo, it could be BT5 Guru. It doesn't matter. Like as long as I just see a level 4, that's all I need.
Yeah, you're really just
Whereas,
getting to the boss monster, and that doesn't like a combo make.
yeah. So
Now,
I think like that's a good way to define combo in Digimon.
mm,
Is just is the deck tailoring itself to find its specific combo pieces, and there's usually more than just one or two of them.
so more of these are hard than easy, I guess, but the other, I guess, point of debate I've seen is what defines an aggro deck in Digimon, and it's a little easier in some ways, right? So I would say any Rookie Rush style deck is aggro based because they are just kind of slamming. They're going wide. They're slamming bodies, and they're swinging. The
And
specific nature of those bodies is less important.
yeah, because I was gonna say, like, it doesn't matter if it's actual Digimon or tamers that are setting up Digimon. Like, as long as you are going wide and going hard and fast, like, that is just what
Hmm.
being aggressive is.
Yeah, blue hybrid would also fall into that category, only because while blue hybrid had many means of control, it used that control as a
To
means of
springboard its aggro,
it just
yeah.
slow its opponents down enough to be faster than them. Its still
Yep.
ultimate game plan was just like, I mean, again, just think of what is a lethal turn to these decks, and that kind of brings you into the scope of what defines each archetype. So for your D Brigade, ideally, though not, that's not really the way that it'll happen, is you swing with probably 3 Commandramon, and then you slam a Darkdramon and swing for lethal after chipping away on the previous turn. Because you played 2 Commandramon, one of the Commandramon from the first turn died, and then played another Commandramon, and maybe you have a Hugurumon thrown in there. It doesn't matter specifically as long as you're potentially meeting that requirement to get Darkdramon in play, or hybrid lethaling with Grumblemon if you had to set up a tamer, but you're just kind of going wide and you're swinging and you don't care if they die. Preferably they don't, but if they don't, that's a plus. You're almost expecting them to die, which is also, I guess, kind of aggro. Is you have expendable pieces.
And a lot of these aggro decks also have like halfway decent control elements inside of them to, again, like what you said with blue hybrids, slow them down enough. We saw this all the way back in BT5 with the yellow green rookie rush, where it was using a lot of the yellow, like Spiral Masquerade, as a means to slow the opponent down. Oh, you're building a wide board as well? Cool. I'm using my wide board to kill your wide board for virtually doing nothing. Now I'm free to go in. Like it's actively slowing down the stuff. Even in Commandramon or D Brigades, like all of the security threats like Ultimate Flare and
Iron Fisted.
Congo, like they're just there to slow down the opponent just barely enough for you to be more aggressive than them.
I think another defining trait of an aggro deck in Digimon is the ability to have room in your package for those combo elements, because you're so focused on winning at the low end, you have all this extra space for other. You know, I don't have as much room in other decks to just include a bunch, like a strict amount of removal or control elements for a deck that's still trying to win in basically 3 turns.
Yeah, it's just it's just extra filler that you're filling with elements to slow down the opponent. Like as a Commandramon deck, I'm not actually expecting to hard play ever Ultimate Flare. Like
Yeah.
that's not a good turn for a Commandramon deck. You'd rather just play one, maybe two Commandramons and call it a turn. Like Ultimate Flare is in there just to try to be a security threat to slow down the opponent enough to be disruptive. Um, while you're trying to maintain your solid board. And a lot of these aggro decks are either hyper efficient, like super low to the ground, or they have some way to like dodge slash recur a lot of their cards' value. So like hybrids, I would say a lot of the hybrid decks are pretty much aggro decks because you just hard slam tamers. The opponent doesn't have a whole lot of way to interact with the tamers, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, you just are sitting with like 5-6 memory, and you just go digivolve into hybrid swing, hybrid swing, hybrid swing, and that's the game. Like that is it.
Um, one of the other things I was thinking of as far as ways to divide, remove arguments for decks crossing lines is if there was an arbitrary rule, this you cannot win or lose until turn 10. Who is more favored in the matchup now is the more aggressive deck. So, um, who is no, not favored, I guess, who's more likely to lose because someone like blue hybrid is still maybe very favored but usually by the end of a game, if it is turn 10 and blue hybrid isn't basically at that hybrid lethal threshold where I'll just play a tamer this turn, not lose, and then swing for game, then they've already kind of lost. Or um, I know the matchup that Zenitsu and I played rather frequently this meta of D Reaper versus Melga X. Melga X has a more aggro shell, not entirely an aggressive deck, but is significantly more aggressive than D Reaper, and as a result, the longer the game went, the more likely I was to win.
Yep. I can say that wholeheartedly and honestly. Yep.
Basically, the game usually boiled down to, especially when we were kind of just getting reps in and playing cards, was do I get Gatekeeper live? If I get Gatekeeper live, I've probably already won, unless he has an immediate way to remove it and then win on the same turn.
Yeah, and security control is also kind of in that boat in terms of like matchup where it's just like after a certain turn count, they usually have the ability to stabilize themselves, and that's usually when the aggro player just cannot win.
Yep.
Although certain aggro decks are kind of like built to actually be somewhat playable in the long game, like again, D Brigades. Just the fact that Dark Dramon puts the cards from your trash back into your deck is like absolutely absurdly insane. But you're only going to be seeing those cards again because it puts them on the top and it locks you out of the other cards in your deck. Yes, you sometimes wouldn't care about that, but sometimes you do. And that actually can sometimes slow you down, even though it's still keeping you in the game longer. That's not necessarily making you win faster, though.
I think the big difference there, though, is that D Brigade has so many cards that because you're not digivolving, you're just hard playing Commandramon or hard playing Hagurumon, that you're not seeing that card draw, and that each play you make is a card down. So even if you're not decking out because you're putting the Darkdramon back, or you're putting the Deep Brigade cards back into your bottom of your deck, but
It's the top.
top of your deck, but you're not decking out, but you're also not necessarily you're still behind cards, I guess is really ultimately what I'm trying to say. You're
Yeah, because you're
each
not
turn,
drawing as many cards as the opponent would.
if you're in a control deck or in a, you know, stack deck, mid-range deck, then every time you play a card minus a tamer, depending on which tamer it is too, a lot of tamers do draw you cards or replace themselves at least. Then every turn you're plus one card total because every other card you play replaces itself. Every time you digivolve, you draw a card, and so you start with your 5, turn 2, 6, turn 3, 7, assuming that you're not hard playing anything and you're not playing any tamers or options that replace themselves. So the aggro decks don't do that. They are hard playing things. They are going down on cards, and you end up at a point where, again, common rookie rush D Brigade situation where it's turn 4. I've potentially begun to stabilize. How many cards does my opponent have in hand? 2.
Yep. I mean, granted, there is a lot of ways for the deck to draw, but most of the time in these types of decks, the draw isn't necessarily like a +1. It is a neutral draw most of the time.
That's what I mean. It just
So
replaces itself.
yeah, so like Hagurumon, like you are drawing two cards, but you're using two cards to draw two cards,
Yeah.
like because you have to discard one and hard play the card, which means you're not digivolving, and then you get the two cards back. So like you're always remaining at a net zero in terms of cards, and then as you just mentioned, when you're hard playing cards and they're not replacing themselves, then now you're going down. Which is why like half the time when you actually like pay attention to your hand count in Digimon, especially like using traditional style decks, you'll have easily a hand of like 8 to 10 to 12 cards, like no problem. Just because a lot of the cards you're digivolving, they're replacing themselves, or you're hard playing it, trying to get 2 for 1. value or plus oneing on card advantage. Um,
Or
just to be
even
able to find your parts and pieces to be able to build the most ideal stack.
or even just control decks that aren't named D Reaper. They are drawing usually more cards or as many cards as they are playing.
Yeah, like Blade of the True is absolutely insane for security control, where it's like it's at worst most of the time drawing you two cards, at best drawing you three to maybe four if you're really lucky.
So, um, yeah, I guess we talked about it a little bit just in reference to the other decks, but what I would define as a control deck in Digimon would be the decks that their goal is to take the game kind of as long as possible, and for each turn that passes in which they don't die, they are more likely to win.
Yep.
So,
I think like based on that definition, a lot of people think that like, Black War Greymon is a more mid-range deck, and I would say it's like a mid-range combo kind of a or not combo, mid-range control. Just because like you get into one Black War and you're able to stabilize the field, keep the opponent off of actually maintaining a field, and then you just get a second stack, and then you basically just have the game from there. Like there is not a lot that they can do against two megas that can deal damage and control the opponent's field.
well, I think the control is the big part of that. So, like, what is the Black War doing? And if the answer is nothing, you're in a bad spot. And if the answer is everything, you're in a good spot. So it just depends. I think that's why I would still classify Black War as like the highest controlliest end of mid range while still ultimately a mid range deck because its specific pieces don't matter as much. Obviously, certain cards are better than others, certain stacks are better than others, but
Yep.
um, its mega is re or defensive, reactive, and controlling in nature. Though it doesn't have to be. It's still like the fact that it can be aggressive would I think leave it out of that control only because if you make a Black War and your opponent has nothing on the field, you're winning so well, you're controlling the game so well that you digivolve and kill nothing. That's actually a pretty shitty place to be in Black War, and you probably lose that game if your opponent has an answer to that Black War.
Yeah. I mean, but that's where you like hold stuff back and you try to set up a secondary stack on the field to try to bait out the opponent into doing certain actions. Like there's still things that you can do to be able to still find a way to control the opponent effectively to make the most out of your boss monsters.
And I think Black War also just unfortunately is on the slower side because it's meant to have more impactful when digivolving effects to balance out the fact that
It's
they
two
are more
colors.
expensive.
Yeah, well, they're more expensive partially because they're two colors. Because like you look at Metal Gray, from BT8, and he costs 40 Evo versus like, oh, here's Metal Gray from EX2 or not EX2, EX one,
Hmm.
and it costs 3. So it's just like okay, it's more expensive because the one digivolving effect is more impactful, and it's two colors versus one.
And it's also just a reactionary effect. It's more expensive and does nothing if they have no board, which
Yeah,
is so that's the downside. That's the controlling element, but it's not a control deck. It it has a better matchup into some control decks, obviously, like um the Metal Gray Inheritable allowing Black War to swing over Mother is huge, like game defining enough to put Black War slash Galmon in the place that is in the meta as a result of its comparison to those other decks and its ability, like it's one of the few instances of Tamer hate, Tamer removal, controlling elements, but I would still say that Black War slash Galmon is still probably just the most controlling of the mid-range slash stack decks.
Yeah, you got a fair point there.
Um,
Because like this is where like decks
Everything else
usually
get
have, yeah,
it's everything
decks
else.
usually have decks usually have more than one classification. If we really want to boil down to it, but most of the time it's easier just to use the one. So I would probably say that yeah, Black War is more mid range, but more towards the control side of mid range. Because like a lot of people like to define mid range as basically, well, it's the deck that likes to win in the middle of speed wise, the
But
aggro versus
yeah,
control matchup.
but Digimon
Like
doesn't
that's
really work that way.
yeah, Digimon doesn't work that way, and I think like more traditional stack based decks are falling into that like mid range type category, just because like it you are playing on a particular tempo, um, that the other decks generally are not playing towards.
Yeah, you're definitely faster than control decks as far as your means with which to end the game. So I think Galmon being a great example of that. They have their Sec +1 from Starter Greymon, Sec +1 from Mel Grey X, and Sec +1 from Galmon. They have means with which to push and end the game, and they also have, but they have control elements in the form of removal, so they can still check the decks that are faster than them, check the actual aggro decks that aim to beat them. If everybody was just allowed to play their things and swing, who would win the faster deck?
Yep, but that's not how Digimon's actually played anymore.
Well, I mean, that's it never, I guess, maybe was, but so
I
even
mean, in the early games, like in all the way back to like BT3, that's kind of what made Rookie Rush so good, is because there just wasn't a lot of like ways to defend against just a wide field of rookies. Like a
mhm,
lot of the removal was more single target removal, and if they're just playing two cards to your one, then obviously by math they're gonna end up winning.
because even
But
Grandis has natures of both sides. Grandis is by nature a stack deck. It wants to just kind of build its stack, and but it runs, at least this one I'm looking at specifically, a full suite of blockers to slow down more aggressive decks if need be, especially digivolving off of either the Kokuamon X that searches or the Tentamon X that just kind of filters itself when hard played. Um, and then you've got the tapping, piercing elements to actually remove pieces while dealing damage. And I think it's that trade-off of like that tempo element of I am not just putting myself more ahead, I'm also putting you more behind. I am widening that gap from both ends. And that's the true mid-range aspect of the deck.
yeah,
Because a lot of like even like Setcon is the premier example of a control deck in Digimon, at least at the moment. Most of its cards either put you more ahead or put your opponent more behind. Very rarely are you doing both.
would you say like Mastimon is more of a control deck? Because like I'm trying to sit there and I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, Mastimon doesn't really play by normal mid-rangey kind of conventions, but like it snowballs pretty hard because of how effective its removal can be to punish the opponent. But it also at the same time relies on, well, I guess the toolboxy nature of your level fives. You don't necessarily need to always play like Lucimon or something. If you don't need to kill something, then you could just always play something like Magna Angemon to recover, or something else to help set up another stack.
I would honestly probably say Mastamon is the least controlling of controlled. I don't maybe not least controlling, but I would almost say it's more control, only because even I pulled up the last Mastamon list that I could find. This is a third place Gen Con, um, and you just look at just the removal suite, right? 4 copies of Flame Health Scythe, 3 copies of Chaos Degradation, 6 Tamers, and then They basically start at the level 4 mark. They don't really run rookies. This deck runs exactly 4 rookies. This list in particular, and also just the fact that security decks that aren't named D Reaper, or control decks that aren't named D Reaper, are usually the hardest to pin down deck list wise because they're so particular to the particular pilot. How many of each removal do you like to run? Do you favor other removal over others? Do you favor certain copies of, like, which level 5s you're running and how many of them in Mastamon is almost exclusively tied to the pilot, and I don't think any any two people could sit down and agree 100% on a Mastamon list.
No, that's the way a lot of Digimon decks kind of are, because like even with Guru decks, like I see people running the red splash, and I personally hate the red splash. I think it slows down the deck, even though it creates like a higher damage ceiling and a safer damage. It's just significantly slower than if you're just running blue, and I think like a lot of decks kind of fall into that category. Some are a little bit easier to optimize than others, sure. In terms of like majority agreements. Um,
Well,
but
I mean,
yeah,
a lot
Mastamon
of
is
the
definitely
a lot
a
of the stack decks I
particularly
think are,
interesting
are
one.
bad examples of that. Like you used, while there are differences in wear lists, I think wear is almost the worst example because you're running 4 copies of the cards you care about, and then it's only the cards you don't that are even debatable. No one's debating whether you need 4 copies of Wear X, 4 copies of Metal X, 4 copies of,
Okay, I guess
you
that's
know what I
yeah,
mean? Like
I guess that is a
that's
bad example, and it's just more of the text splash. Like, what are you doing with your
yeah,
leftover cards
because your tech is your
after your
tech.
core?
Whereas
Yeah.
these are core cards. How many copies of Lady Devimon should you run? How many copies of Magda Angemon should you run? Like, there are obviously better cards that are less debatable, but again, it's just the cards that are more required for the list. Usually 4 Mastamon is fairly standard. 4 copies of Gatomon is fairly standard. 4 copies of Flame
I
Hellscythe.
And then the rest is just kind of personal liberties,
But
really. Like thinking about
because
it.
there's a lot of there's a lot of freedom. For this list particularly is running 4 copies of Zwart Defeat. That is not necessarily standard. That is not necessarily common. Um, this is running 3 copies of Chaos Degradation. I don't know. Like I mean, usually these control decks are, you could throw them all and pull their averages out and come up with a single non-functioning deck because all you're doing is looking at different versions of the same deck that don't necessarily play well with each other. Whereas if you took the most average metal list, you're still running a functional deck at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm not gonna disagree with that.
Um, Again, decks that aren't named D Reaper because their tech options are incredibly limited. Just by deck construction. Um, Even so, yeah. Let's actually, if I just close a couple tabs. Yeah, so these are 2 different um security control lists. They're running very, very different cards. Um,
And part of this is just kind of what makes these like control decks kind of expensive, is because a lot of their parts and pieces usually are higher rarity, on top of the fact that like the flexibility on how many tools and pieces they have access to is partially why that they're very expensive.
yeah, every deck has its staples, so it's just
Yeah,
looking
like
at, like,
Magna Angemon is the staple of security control.
yeah,
Like
both
you kind of just need 4 copies of that if you're playing security control.
4 copies of Salamon, 4 copies of Magna Angemon, but it basically only, and I guess usually like why these kinds of decks are in the discussion as far as like their difficulty and uniqueness of deck construction is they're running different eggs. Like straight up, like they are running. Is there how many different eggs are debatable in metal?
Um, you can make an argument to play Upamon, but like the deck already has lots of card draw where you just really don't need it.
Two, but I guess argument versus practice. How many decks have topped I mean, I don't have the number in front of me either. Can you
All
find
all of them are playing. I could save you the time. They're all playing Sunamon. They're
exactly?
all playing BT5 Sunamon because the DP is more important than the card draw because they already have card draw.
So they're really arguability versus practicality. No one's using the second best option. These are both running two different eggs. Um, One is running 3 copies of Sakuyamon, one is running two. Okay, that's, you know, fairly comparable. One's running 4 copies of Dexmon, one's running two. Okay, that's half as many. You know, if one person topped running 2 copies of Metal X, that would be very different, right? As opposed to every
Yeah.
other list. Um, and then there's just the cards that show up that like literally aren't in other lists. This one's running a copy of Gallantmon Crimson mode. Well,
Yeah, because they want to use Avenge Kidmon to his utmost potential, so they dedicated a slot to be able to, oh, my Avenge Kidmon's sticking? Cool, here's a Gallantmon to
mhm,
Digivolve into and then screw the opponent over because, well, their trash is nice and full because I killed everything.
mhm. Yeah, honestly, and it's something that people wouldn't expect because the deck allows for that flexibility there. That's just something that something like your Metal X or your um, Alphamon
And
less have control over.
And the major argument for Viximon over Upamon, because a lot of people do that, is a lot of your options are costing two or more. So
Mhm.
Viximon is just easier card draw earlier on versus Upamon, where you need to be at a specific amount that you actually don't want to be at.
Yeah.
Like yes, it does combo better with Salamon, and that's like the only time Salamon's going to be swinging. But again, if that's the only time Salamon's going to be swinging, just having a Salamon sit on the field, be that threat of the body to potentially recover, just allows you to just do what blue hybrids used to do, and they just sit on those cards and they'll just accrue value. And that's what made Kiaramon way better than Upamon in terms of an egg. Like you don't want to always swing.
Mm. Yeah, you get the card draw without having to swing with your floodgate,
Yeah,
which was huge.
yep. And Yellow Hybrids is adopting the same style of thinking where it's just like I don't have to swing with the card that isn't going to recover me. I could sit on it and recover later off of it. And if they waste their resources trying to kill it, cool. Like whatever. If I do choose to swing with it early after drawing off of Vixie, also cool. It literally did its job.
Now, something that I'm not a huge fan of in Digimon, unfortunately, is just by the nature of the rules, by the nature of the cards we currently have access to, there are no true like inter-turn interactive cards outside of a very couple examples. But even the a lot of the inter-turn cards are inter-turn effects are at least triggered by your opponent agreeing to take a penalty for something or something. Like Don Devimon, from way back when, is a controlling card, but it says when your opponent attacks me, I lose a security, you lose a security once per turn. That is a tax for swinging. It's a tax for attacking me, but it's a single use effect, and it is also an effect by which you are ultimately triggering. I don't have the ability to hold that back to say, okay, I don't want to use it right now. I don't want to use it right. Okay, now, like, if there's ever a situation where I'm going to wait for you to recover one, and now I'm more afraid of that card you recovered. Now I choose to trash your card. Like, basically, interrupting effects, ultimately, I guess, is something we really lack in Digimon. Cards where I stop, like outside of security, where I stop what you're doing to do something on your turn.
Well, I think Digimon also kind of just doesn't want that from a design perspective because like they want you to be able to do your stuff for the most part, but those controlling type cards, like yes, you are agreeing to do that and suffer the penalty, but at least you're still doing it. Like that's kind of the whole crux of it. Like I don't want to sit there and just have a game where the opponent just tells me no, you might as well just give up because you can't play a card because I have too much inter-turn interaction. Like
Mm-hmm.
Magic is notoriously infamous for that with its blue decks, where it'll play like a 1/1, and then the rest of the deck is draw spells and counter spells to stop the opponent from literally doing anything as they're just slowly watching themselves die. Yu-Gi-Oh has this with God, I'm forgetting the deck, but it's the Final Countdown deck, where the whole goal of the deck is to just stop the opponent from literally doing anything, and then just wait 20 turns and Final Countdown just auto wins you the game. Like, those are the worst, most unfun experiences that Japanese players tend to hate.
Yeah.
Or like Japanese game designers don't like to do because they like big, splashy, cool things happening.
And
Also, it slows down the game immensely, and they
well,
don't have time for that.
so that's something that I remember I really just had to reflect on because I feel like I've brought it up a couple times now that going to time wasn't as common when I played Magic. It wasn't something that, or at least like, tying because, oh, like we went to time and then nobody won, so it's a tie, just happened so less frequently when I played Magic because even with those control decks, you just hit a point where you had lost. Basically, it was the equivalent of the Metal X versus Gatekeeper situation, but you actually had no ways out because as the player who was up as the control player, I had a way to you found a Cocytus breath. Okay, counterspell. Like if you did have a single point of removal to get rid of my card, I could tell you no. At least enough times to where the board state would remain the same and you would still have nothing on the field or you still had no way to win the game. And again, as you mentioned, the most extreme control decks being um, their only way of actually winning the game was via um, man lands or what was it called? Field of Ruin? I'm trying to remember.
Just a card to recur you a body to be able to swing with, or just a card to just stick on the field
Not
long
Field
enough
of
to
Ruin.
be. It's Field of the Dead.
Field of the Dead, yeah.
That's why Magic players hate like
It
lands
was
that
it
also
was
shit
eventually banned,
bodies.
but yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's why they don't like
Yep.
battle lands, like lands that occur
Ban
some
lands.
sort of physical value on the
Mhm.
field to deal
Yep.
damage.
Like this card just kind of screams, control for Magic. Whenever Field of the Dead or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, so it's it's been a while. It's, usually you only get one land per turn outside of ramp. Create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So it just gave you a small body just for playing a land every turn. And that's all you did was you played lands, you made bodies, and you just made sure that your opponent could not play a single card. And that's
I
a control deck.
I mean, like, yes, Digimon is a completely different game and we don't exactly have that, but what I'm saying is I don't want that. Like,
I
out of
know.
a control deck, I don't want that. Like, the fact that people already complain with security control being the most excruciatingly painful game they've ever played of Digimon, like that's the most that I really want.
But
Like, I
so
think Bagra Army come later sets is a good example of like how they can start implementing inner turn interaction, and that opens up avenues for other abilities like delay cards that happen during the opponent's turn off of a specific trigger. But then again, like, you're telegraphing the control stakes and control elements, which is fine because it allows you to play around it. And if you can't, then you have to play into it, and then you're playing into the control hands, like into their traps, essentially.
I think the biggest pain point there though is the unknown, and it's not the unknown of actually because again, Magic we're off a different resource system, so if I'm a blue player and I'm floating 2 mana, basically I have 2 untapped lands and it is your turn, there is a counterspell potentially coming. Or 3 depending on which format you're playing. But so
I mean, but
that is
like
that is
this,
the known signal. Security doesn't have that. Security is I have to go through it to win the game. Technically, um, you know, I could be bluffing, right? Because I know what my cards in my hand are in Magic. You don't. I don't know what my cards in Security are but neither of us do. But at least there's some bluffing aspect to it. It's not really bluffing in Security Control because it basically be the same as if in Magic, like um uh if instead of mana you had like Vanguard based triggers where okay you attack, I flip the top card of my deck, oh it's a counter spell, I kill your like that all it's all Security is a random draw, and I rig that draw by putting as many kill cards as I can in my deck because in Magic I still have to pay for those kill cards. I still have to pay for counter spells, and if I pass my turn and I don't have enough mana to counter spell, you get free reign. I have completely expended my resources, and now you can acknowledge that you can do whatever the hell you want this turn and this turn only. Whereas in Magic or in Digimon, that is never true because as long as cards remain in my security, I have ways to kill you without playing a single card or doing a single thing.
Well, this is where like the beauty of chess kind of comes in, where it's just like it does kind of play more chess-like in terms of the control. Like there's control strategies in chess. Like there's
Yeah,
ways
but
to try to force and manipulate the opponent into a bad action, and that's what Digimon's control is, and I'm okay with that because that takes a specific level of thought that isn't existent in any other card game really. It's just like, okay, I could see you're telegraphing you have a counterspell. I could either try to play a card and bait it out, or I could read
or
try
am
to
I
read into
bluffing?
the bluff.
Yeah, you
Yes.
know.
But like that's a different type of a mind game where, oh, I physically cannot play this because it is just dead based on board state. Like that is something completely, those are two completely different ends. And I think Digimon leans into the chess side of things beautifully because that to me is just more interesting than, oh, they, all right, they just counterspelled me. Can I try again?
Well,
Oh, they counterspelled me again. Are they finally out of counterspells? Oh no, all right,
well,
whatever.
but chess is operating on, fully known information. All information to play and win the game is available at all times, whereas in Magic it's at least partially available, and in Digimon it is never available. You don't know if you walk
Well,
into a
that's
game,
the point. I
but
prefer the
that's
chess aspect
that's not
rather
chess
than,
though. Chess is all information available at all times. Digimon is no information because
well,
you
I
have
mean,
no what.
like you do have the RNG of security, but like there are stuff and tactics that you could apply in Digimon to be able to manipulate the opponent's actions.
But
It
what's the
it's
difference
like,
between me playing 5 counterspells or me just happening to have, you know, 4 ultimate flares and 1 Gaia Force in security? How do you win that as Melga X? Right? I have 4 ultimate flares in security every game.
I mean, you don't,
You
but
don't. But that's not
that's
chess. That's what I'm saying. Is that you can't control that. That isn't you're not
well, this
there's
is where calculated risks start taking place, where it's just like, okay, I know they're a security control player. How do I change and adapt my strategy to be able to be able to beat their strategy? Like that's something that like you have to assess the game completely differently, and that's a mindset that a lot of players just don't necessarily have. Like, and they didn't have at the beginning when security control was this unknown force. It's just like, oh, I swung into their hit a Gaia Force. Next thing I knew, I drew out my deck because I kept trying to evolve back into my Mega over and over again. And then next thing I know, I decked myself out. Like that that unknownness does have some mental manipulation on how players approach the game. Like into a security control matchup, I'm not always going to want to digivolve straight all the way up. Or sometimes, if I know they're playing a Black Splash with Ultimate Flare, I might need to go higher than I normally would to be able to keep my main stack alive. Like those are actions as a player that I need to assess. There's no real playing around. Oh, they have a counterspell. I either play into it or I just don't play. Period.
Yeah, there is. You
That
just play
that's
something that you don't mind getting counterspelled. The same reason that you're saying,
well,
but the difference is you know, you could play your low body and then I don't counterspell you, and then you play a big body and I do counterspell you. You still get a low body. In Digimon, if you digivolve to level 4, I do nothing. You digivolve to level 5, I then do something, your whole stack is still gone.
It really depends, but I'm not huge on hand traps and just
Hmm.
complete and utter like disruptive things coming out of nowhere. Like I guess Digimon right now is a lot of damage out of nowhere, but and that's kind of infuriating for a lot of players. But at least like it's kind of telegraphed to where you should know what the opponent is doing at a higher competitive level, and you should be able to read and assess the situation properly to be able to try to counteract it, which is why a lot of players like playing Guilemon, is because he does literally that beautifully, where it's just like, oh, as a Metal Guru player, how do I beat over a card that can't be bounced and is larger than any of my other bodies? Like, how do I win that situation? Like, there's not a whole lot of options left to you. And identifying those types of positions and situations is like interesting in terms of a control aspect.
I
Because it's
think
like, oh, I hard slam Sakuyamon. Now your raising is basically turned off. What do you do in that situation? Is the question that's being presented. And if your answer is nothing, then you're going to lose. Otherwise, you have to come and change up your gameplay style and figure something else out.
I think it's just especially the swingy nature because again, with at no control of the like receiving player does like you could play security control and they could have four Salamons and a Magna Angemon in security, and you're like, what? This is supposed to be hard. This is supposed to be a difficult matchup. I swung and I never died. Like my Melga X swung as many times as it could have, and it never died. And then I just won the game, and my opponent had no means with which to control me or anything. But in other times, again, you're Melga X against four Ultimate Flares and a Gaia Force, and or at least the most oppressive form of removal. Obviously, you can stop. Maybe if you hit a Gaia Force first, but if you hit a Gaia Force last, you're probably less likely to be able to stop it, especially the fourth or fifth time you fight, you hit one. But um,
Well,
in
that's the Beelstar problem because they actually run Digimon to try to set up their trash to make Beelstar as effective as they possibly can
mm,
at just getting her to be as low costed as they possibly can to use lots of removal type of abilities and varied removal type of abilities at the risk of having weaker security and the fact that it doesn't have any recovery ability. Um, so like your security is either going to be cracked and you can easily win that matchup because you also use your lower end to chip and aggress, or your security is just butt and there's not a lot you can do, and that just does happen. um which is why control isn't super great in Digimon. um and that, like I said, that's totally okay because usually control decks try to slow down the pace of the game, and Japanese game design does not like slow. They don't.
yeah, I
And
do.
that's just a cultural thing. Like they don't like slow because they don't have time for slow. That's why they play best of one and we play best of three.
Mm, the the control elements that do exist, I do enjoy, though. Um, potentially shocking information. I don't like to play into or against, or play as or against security control. I just don't think it's fun. I don't think it's interesting, and I don't think you're making meaningful choices as a control player. I think there are other decks that you could be playing as a control player that at least have interesting choices to be made, control elements to interact with your opponent, and I think especially in the direction they're going, um, I haven't really gotten a playtest yet, so I don't know if it's any good actually, but the BT11 Bagra army, as far as its manipulation of resources mostly, not necessarily manipulation of actual I have Digimon on the field or I don't have Digimon on the field or what those Digimon can do. That is, I think, more towards the things they're trying to avoid, like Zenitsu said, but more along the lines of um, BT11 Lilith allows you, when an opponent's Digimon moves in the breeding area by trashing a card in this Digimon sources, that Digimon gets, when attacking, lose 3 memory for the turn. It's allowing them to do something with their Digimon if they want to, but there's a cost associated with it. And what it doesn't say in that text box is all the Bagra army lower level Digimon basically all have the same uh, inheritable ability of opponent's turn when this is trashed by an effect, gain a memory. So you're taxing them like you're taxing them just for existing, period. They raised a Digimon. I trash a source. Even if you weren't going to swing with that Digimon anyway, you've lost a memory already.
And that one memory, especially depending on the deck, actually can make or break certain plays, which is the type of control I'm a little bit more okay with because you could avoid those actions and try to play around it. But if you're playing into it, then it just makes things progressively harder. And that's like literally the whole point. Like that card is probably one of the better examples of like how I like the control in Digimon to be. Sakuyamon is another example of this. It was like the predecessor. Like you do have things that like they do have ways to be able to put inter-turn interaction and making it fun, meaningful, and not just absolutely painful and RNG based.
Um, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but I think we have talked so much about control. I at least want to interject my thoughts on design as far as it's concerned with the other end of the spectrum, because I think aggro is more problematic, and I think while everyone complains about security control, ultimately security control isn't that bad and isn't a huge problem because it doesn't really win events. What is a
It's
problem
just
is
annoying.
aggro, because if while it is annoying that security control can have five super awesome kill spells in security and just recover every turn and exist and you can't kill them, it's way worse when it's your opponent's second turn and they raise a level 4 and kill you, which is we're moving closer to that situation depending on certain cards we're seeing, and as they continue to print better, more efficient, more aggressive cards, that is just more likely. Obviously, Melga X cannot actually completely end the game on the second turn with, no memory. But if you give them enough memory, they can. And even if you don't, they can put themselves in a fantastic position if they see the right cards. So that's something I think the game needs to check way more than it needs to check control elements. Because that's way less
And
fun. Is you losing the game without getting to do anything.
I would agree. And based on what we've seen, like there's still a progression that is happening. It's not necessarily happening towards that, but they're just having more efficient ways to be aggressive. We see this with Cross Hearts, that's like known for being one of the best aggro based decks, just because it hard slams Tamers. The Tamers play Digimon. Digimon reuses itself, and like that is just hardcore aggro at its core. And it's not an OTK deck. Like it doesn't have the ability to just be like, okay, it's turn two, you should be dead or all your security should be broken. It's like, no, it doesn't do that. So like they do have ways to artificially slow themselves down in terms of game speed, which is a whole nother argument. The OTK decks are probably the most egregious, just because of their innate design, where it's like you get the good stack and you could just win turn two, turn three without even thinking about it. Um, but aggro as a whole, I don't necessarily think is a problem. Like the game always kind of was high damage. It was just how fast it could get to those high damage stakes. Because we've had all the way back in BT 1 or 1.0, the ability to break 5 security in a single swing. Like we've always had that.
It's just how quickly
Um,
and how efficiently, or how quickly and how consistently are you getting there? Because something that
yes,
has changed is the
the
we're
consistency
almost
is
creating
going
like
up.
speed tiers. Like if anyone's played Pokemon, they know what I mean. But like the video game, not the card game, but speed tiers as far as like these are the decks that can win consistently by turn 3 or 4, and if you're not there and you're not a control deck and you have no means of slowing down the other decks, you're competitively irrelevant. Because I don't care how good your combo is on turn 6, like Ancient Greymon. Ancient Greymon OTK is the perfect example. Technically, if it sees all its pieces exactly in the order that it wants to, it is a very, very powerful, almost inevitable deck. But it doesn't. and that's why it's fallen completely to the wayside compared to Metal X, because Metal X just filters so much because it's constantly drawing and it has a decent amount of protection and some flexibility in its pieces. And those things combined form a very consistent turn count for winning the game, assuming that your opponent doesn't interact with them or they don't die to security.
Yeah, and I think just balancing that game speed is more of the trick. So like obviously a higher amount of searchers and low cost evolutions are two huge factors towards a game speed. Like if Ancient Greymon doesn't see its parts and pieces, especially in the order that it needs to see them, then the deck kind of just stumbles and fumbles, and then it's acting slower. And that's where searchers come in to try to help find all of those to speed things up, which is why the memory boost cards are so good, is because it's a consistency tool and an engine tool, because like it's finding your parts and pieces while accelerating your gameplay later when you need it to.
So I guess that's just my piece as far as things that the designers need to watch out for. As far as I wouldn't go too far and make things too controlling. Obviously, I want people to be able to play the game, but I also don't want I again just want people to be able to play the game, and that also means that having more than two turns, preferably, or more than one turn if you're going second and your opponent gets two turns and they just win the game.
Like they just need to stop like the biggest thing is they just need to assess how fast a deck can move and the amount of damage it can deal. So like a lot of these BT9 decks are all of the X antibody decks are super OTK because they use Cool Boy as like their best digging tool and engine setup tool for when you're comboing off to gain extra resources to be able to extend or make your plays possible. Um, and like that type of a card just helps accelerate decks where it's just like you look at a deck like Cross Hearts and it doesn't have like a hardcore this is the acceleration point. It's like, oh, do you have the tamer that allows you to use inheritable or use the materials underneath your tamers? If you do, you're in a if you do, you're in a good spot. If you don't, you're in a bad spot. And that is kind of what Cross Hearts lives and dies on.
Hmm.
And BT BT11 just adds an extra instance of that where it's like, okay, here's just another piece to be able to try to do your game plan.
Yeah.
And
So,
then at the same time they introduce more tamer hate, so it's like, okay,
uh,
there's lots of balances that they have.
with that, I believe that's all the time we have for today. So I'm going to head and say goodbye here. Join us next week for our discussion on the differences between the North American and Japanese metas for BT9.
And with that, goodbye.